Get this. Trudeau said Canada doesn't use slave labor. In a recent statement, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused China of using slave labor while claiming that Canada doesn't. I get what Trudeau's doing. Amidst all the unfounded claims about he and his Liberal Party being tied to China or influenced by China, he is trying to lash out with ridiculous claims. Listen, I wish China was interfering in Canadian politics, but the only claims of this come from anonymous CSIS sources. The CSIS is the Canadian CIA, and they're exactly as reliable as the CIA when it comes to Canada's geopolitical rivals. That is to say, not at all. Canada was quite literally built on slave labor and genocide. After the colonization of the Americas, Indigenous people in Canada were forced to work for colonizers as domestic servants or laborers. Canada even used black slaves like the US did, albeit to a lesser extent. Slavery was practiced in Canada until its abolition in 1834. Africans were enslaved and forced to work in various capacities, including agriculture, domestic labor, and manual labor. And sure, that type of chattel slavery may be mostly in the past, but Canada is not afraid to brutally exploit poor people at the behest of the rich and mega corporations. But we'll get into that in a bit. Here's the Toronto Star article about what Trudeau claimed. Justin Trudeau says Canadian critical minerals are more expensive than China's because we don't use slave labor. Quite a bold claim there. It's not clickbait, it's almost verbatim what he said. And if we're being honest, said Trudeau, lithium produced in Canada is going to be more expensive because we don't use slave labor. Of course he uses the qualifier, produced in Canada, though. Canada is one of many capitalist developed nations that exploits the global south for slave labor. They outsource their slave labor to the global south. Canada's neocolonialism in Africa knows no bounds. There are entire African countries that are essentially ruled over by Canadian mining corporations. Like in Eritrea, where a Vancouver-based mining firm called Nevsun Resources was sued for human rights violations, including forced labor, slavery, and torture. According to documents filed in court, Nevsun's vice president Trevor Moss knew that forced labor was being used in the Eritrean mines. A social development expert from the US was brought in to review the operation, and they said that Nevsun were not avoiding it. They were very much aware of it. The lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. This is the punishment that Canadian corporations get for using slave labor. They have to give back a tiny portion of the wealth that they brutally extracted from African countries. They get to keep the rest of it. Here's a quote. She said workers described being bound and beaten, tied up in the hot sun and left for hours, while earning about $30 US per month. There was no sick leave, and they faced retribution that affected their families if they took any leave. Absolutely sickening. This is Canada's contribution to the world, and that's just one example of many. Here's another. Canadian mining firm apologizes to protester shot outside Guatemalan mine. Canadian neocolonialism isn't restricted to Africa. It happens in Central America too. Tahoe Resources Inc., also from British Columbia, shot several Guatemalans who were protesting against Canadian mining operations in their area. From K. Diallo on Twitter, 75% of mining companies globally are now Canadian. Canada is a great source of corporate neocolonialism expansion. Just look at how much of Africa is controlled by Canadian mining corporations. And this map is outdated. The Canadian investment into Africa has only increased since. Yellow Parenti said it best.
The third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
But Trudeau is hoping that Canadians will just avoid these uncomfortable facts like they do with most things about Canada. He does it by poisoning their minds with China bad narratives. This also applies to climate change. Canadians love to point out the fact that China is the biggest sole contributor to climate change, but they refuse to acknowledge the fact that Canada is the #1 per capita polluter in the world, by a huge margin also, almost 3 times as much as China. They also like to avoid the topic of slave labor within Canada itself. Human trafficking is quite prevalent in Canada. There are countless examples of people being trafficked for labor or sex work. The Global Slavery Index estimates that on any given day in 2016 there were 17,000 people living in conditions of modern slavery in Canada, a prevalence of 0.5 victims for every 1,000 people in the country. This includes forced labor, forced sexual exploitation of adults and children, and forced marriage. The Temporary Foreign Worker Program and the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program in Canada are stable sources of slave labor. Here's a quote. Migrant workers, particularly those in low-skilled and caregiving positions, reportedly experience a wide range of abuse, including verbal, physical, and sexual abuse. Specific examples include working without pay, performing tasks outside the scope of the employment contract, not receiving vacation or overtime pay, working extremely long hours, deduction of fees for food or accommodation from paychecks, and particularly for women, sexual violence. So yes, Trudeau, Canada does use slave labor domestically. You could even say that in its purest and simplest form, every wage worker in Canada is a slave. Housing is not considered a human right in Canada. You must sell your labor for pennies on the dollar to some rich capitalist asshole to have a roof over your head. This is modern slavery. The oft-used term, earn a living, implies that by default you do not deserve to live. This happens in every capitalist country. But what about China? Does Trudeau have a point there? Not really. Let's go back to the Toronto Star article. Canada and the US have condemned the Chinese government's use of forced labor camps in China's northwest province of Xinjiang, where the mainly Muslim Uyghur population has faced repressive surveillance, mass arbitrary detention, torture and mistreatment, forced labor, and mass transfers of forced laborers from Xinjiang to provinces across China. Another bold claim. The Star links to a Canadian government website report about forced labor in Xinjiang. The very first source they use in that report is for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Yes, that's another CSIS, but not the same as the previously mentioned Canadian CIA. However, this CSIS is US government funded. From Wikipedia, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, lists major funding from defense contractors such as Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, Raytheon Company, and General Atomics. Significant funding has come from the governments of the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and the UAE. To prove that China is using forced labor, the Canadian government is linking to an American government-funded think tank. They are also funded by defense contractors. They exist to fearmonger about China to bolster defense spending in the US and make these defense contractors billions and billions of dollars. Fantastic source. That CSIS report cites Adrian Zenz 12 times. If you didn't know, Adrian Zenz is a far-right Christo-fascist that believes God sent him to Earth to westernize China. He's a senior China fellow at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is funded by the US government to spread lies about America's geopolitical enemies and communism as a whole. They published the widely discredited Black Book of Communism, where they lied about the victims of communism. The Canadian report on forced labor in Xinjiang also sources the US State Department and Adrian Zenz directly, as well as the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Like CSIS, the ASPI is funded by the Australian Department of Defense, the US government, and several defense contractors. They exist to bolster defense spending for Australia by creating an enemy in China. Earlier on in that Toronto Star article, they mentioned Volkswagen picking Canada for their new EV battery plant. Still, Trudeau pointed to the decision by German automaking giant Volkswagen to choose Canada over other North American jurisdictions. He said, "We're prepared to spend a lot more money for its giant new electric vehicle battery plant." Now, it's really, really interesting that Trudeau would use Volkswagen as an example here. Volkswagen has a plant in Xinjiang. They sent an exec over there to figure out if the allegations of forced labor were true. And guess what? They found nothing. They found zero proof of forced labor in Xinjiang. Canada, and especially the US, wants to take jobs away from Uyghur Muslims. They use Adrian Zenz to fearmonger about cotton harvesting in Xinjiang. They want to evoke the image of black slaves in America picking cotton by hand. What they don't tell you, though, is that this is a Xinjiang cotton farm. They use combine harvesters piloted by Uyghurs who have learned that skill in the vocational schools that the West loves to call internment camps. The US and Canada pretends to care about the well-being of Muslims while actively harming them. This is quite typical considering the US still runs a Muslim torture camp in the part of Cuba that they stole and forcibly occupy to this day, Guantanamo Bay. We have extensive proof of slave labor in Canada. We have no tangible evidence of slave labor in Xinjiang or China as a whole. We have nothing but reports funded by the US government or Raytheon or Lockheed Martin. We have nothing but statements from exiled Uyghurs that bring about Naira testimony vibes. Stop deflecting, Trudeau. Worry about your own slave labor. Now, like this video and subscribe to the channel, or I'll post the Trudeau blackface picture.